Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us for our last panel discussion on the right to disconnect. Digitalization has facilitated working outside of the traditional office setting and has protected many roles throughout the pandemic. However, the ability to extend the working day and to be able to send, receive, and check emails wherever you are has become habitual for some. This new code of practice is timely as we see regular reports and research on burnout, which has grown during the pandemic. With this in mind, it's important to discuss how employers can reduce the need of this always-on culture, in addition to supporting employees understand the importance of switching off and how spending time in recovery is important as well. So today, I'm joined by Lorna Layden and Professor Mark Cropley to discuss this subject. Lorna is a senior HR business partner at Diageo and has previously worked within tech, pharmaceutical, and financial services, holding HR and commercial positions, both in Ireland and abroad. She's joining us today to share HR best practice, and she's also an associate member of the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development. Mark is a chartered psychologist and professor of health psychology at the University of Surrey, UK. He conducts research in the areas of stress and health, and he is particularly interested in how people unwind and recover from the effects of work. He is the author of the popular self-help book, The Off Switch, and is also a member of Ziva Health's Scientific Advisory Board. So today we're going to aim to bring research and practice together, and delighted to have Lorna and Mark here as we do that. So I'm going to hand across to Lorna to kick it off and to just give us a brief overview of what this code of conduct, this code of practice is on the right to disconnect.
Absolutely. Thanks, Davina. So yes, you mentioned that the code is timely. It's absolutely timely. I suppose the government came out with the code on the 1st of April in response to the fact that employees are becoming more available in terms of work, when they work, where they work and how they work. So the code was introduced back in April, and whilst it's not legally binding and failure to comply with the code is not an offence, it is worthwhile for employers to pay attention to the code. One, because I suppose it is the right thing to do, but two, it's also something that could be admissible in Workplace Relations Commission and Labour Court hearings. So I suppose that's an important sort of element, but I suppose it's important to understand as well, what do we mean by the right to disconnect under the code? So there's sort of three areas that it includes for employers to be aware of. One is that it's a right for an employee not to routinely perform work outside of their normal working hours, so whatever those hours might be for that employee. So again, employers and other folks should refrain from sort of regularly contacting folks outside of their normal working hours. I think the second piece to call out is an employee has a right not to be penalised for refusing to attend to work matters outside of normal working hours. And finally, it's the duty to respect another person's right to disconnect. So again, just being mindful not to routinely email or contact somebody outside of what their normal working hours would be. I suppose what's interesting with the code as well is it covers all employees, regardless of the type of work they do. So everybody who is an employee is covered by the code. And I think an important piece to call out as well is the code references the, I suppose, responsibility of both the employer and the employee in relation to that disconnect piece and that right to disconnect. So the onus is on both the employer and the employee. But there are a couple of things that the code also calls out that employers should pay attention to. Some simple things that employers should maybe put in place with the code coming into practice. One is to introduce a right to disconnect policy. Now, some employers and companies might have more significant working time policies or flexible policies that you might just add this onto. But equally, you could put that policy together separately. And a really helpful thing that the Workplace Relations have done is at the end of the code that they've prepared, they've created a policy template. So any employer can go in, pick up the policy template and implement it. So that's one thing that an employer could do and should probably think about doing with the code. Secondly, an important call out is maybe to set up some company-wide training if you are implementing that policy or way of working. I think an important element with the code is that it's not just a policy and a training, but there's a maybe need for cultural shift and awareness around this right to disconnect, both from managers and employees alike. And something that a lot of employers are doing, we're seeing more of it come through in business, is introducing, it's a very simple thing to do, but introducing email footers and automatic out-of-office responses. Again, just highlighting that employees are not required to respond outside of working hours. It's a really effective thing, and any employee or company can introduce that. But another thing to call out is there's one thing about introducing the code internally, but also if you've customers and clients, as most companies will have, it's about ensuring that they are aware of that expectation expectation that you're setting in respect of receiving responses outside of normal working hours for your employees. So there's a couple of pieces there that are worth calling out for employers to pay attention to.
Thanks, Lorna. Very concise overview. And I think even just understanding how the right to disconnect code of practice interacts with flexibility and autonomy over work is going to be important. Do you have any thoughts just to add to that before we move on to why we need to think about switching off and recovery?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point, Davina, on the flexibility and that autonomy. I think, if anything, some of the silver linings, if we can call them, from the pandemic is we've seen that people can deliver performance, working autonomously and working away from the office. I think ensuring that we sort of maintain that piece, the code just helps us to do that, but also that we don't sort of go backwards in terms of giving that autonomy and flexibility to folks will be an important part as we come out of the pandemic, and also with the code underpinning that as well.
That's great. Thanks, Lorna. So, Mark, with your background and your key research areas in stress and health and unwinding and recovery from work, can you give us some information as to why it's important to facilitate your team's well-being, to encourage them to switch off from work?
I think the key really is to recharge the batteries. So simply stated, we're getting this habit where we're continually working, and we need really to let our bodies relax, unwind from work. And if we're continually working, the body's producing cortisol, your heart rate increases, your heart rate variability decreases, and you just simply don't rest in the evening, and you don't sleep properly, and then you can't hit the ground running the next day. So we know that it's in order to be engaged in work, you need to be fully rested, and then you can hit the ground running. A few years ago, when I first started working in psychology, we used to really look at how stress affects health. So stress at work, school teachers, it used to be air traffic controllers, used to be the high stress group. But we now know it's not necessarily the stress at work which is the issue, it's the speed of recovery, how quickly somebody recovers. And I think of it in terms of an athlete. So if an athlete runs 100 meters, perhaps they could run the 100 meters in 10 seconds. I'm not sure what the record is. If you then run it again, perhaps you could run it in 9.5 seconds. But if you carry on running, it'll go to 11 seconds, 12 seconds, and before long, it'll be 15, 20 seconds. So actually performance decreases the longer we work. And I think the research suggests that any more than sort of 48, 50 hours of work a week, and actually decreases performance and sometimes decreases motivation. And unfortunately, the work suggests that I think we're at an increased risk for certainly cardiovascular disease, but stroke. I forget what the figure, I think it's like 27% increase in stroke if you work more than 50 hours a week. So there's a number of reasons, not only for the work side of things, for company side of things, but also for the individual, why it's important to switch off. We need to keep away from work, get away from work, and let the body and the brain sort of relax. And I like to say come back to some kind of baseline, but we don't really know what the baseline is because we're a dynamic system, so it always changes. But the idea is we need to sort of smooth out a bit and go and let the body have periods of relaxation.
Definitely, and it'd be fair to say that that's a conscious process. So, for example, closing your laptop, finishing work, and then going to sit down and watch the TV, or being on your iPhone or any phone, that might not have the restorative process that we think it might have. No,
I think it's tempting, particularly with sort of, I don't like using the word modern technology because it's been around probably 20 years now, and it's tempting if you're thinking about work. See, one of the problems also I think at the moment, work has perhaps become more interesting for a lot of people. So instead of making things now, we do a lot more thinking, and sort of, especially if you work in the sort of creative field, you may think, oh, I've got a great idea, I'll just spend 5 minutes jotting this idea down or checking the email, and before long it's been 2 hours and it's actually work. I think people don't realise checking emails is actually work outside of work, so we're actually doing more hours. And I think that's the key, is to educate people that it's actually working. It's not, you actually sort of, you're less productive. And also the work we've been doing, it seems to suggest if you don't actually work and you switch off in the evening, There's lots of examples in science where you get the key idea when you're not actually thinking about work. So you're away from work and you're not really thinking about work, and suddenly this key idea. I'm not saying it happens all the time, but occasionally it happens, and something popped. You may be thinking about a problem all day at work, and you can't solve the problem because your brain's busy doing other things. You try not to think about something, and suddenly the problem's resolved. So lots of positives for switching off.
It's that saying, slow down to speed up in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, less rush, more haste, is it? I can't remember. Yeah.
So, Mark, I'm just going to follow up on a question in response to the policy. So, Lorna, you were talking about the policy and how to create one for businesses. I'm wondering, Mark, if you'd be able to share some insights on how policy affects behaviour change and how it might help align an organisation in an approach.
In terms of the new policy, this is quite a difficult one in terms of putting the policy, because at the end of the day, people are very individual, and I know there's people put policies in place. We have policies at work about not answering emails at certain times, and I think the importance here really is getting the culture, getting the buy-in from the organisation to actually put the policy in place. And I don't think it's a lot of companies will produce this sort of values the slogan or label, send it to all the employees, these are our values, but unless you act on these values, nothing really happens. So I think action is the key, and we've done some work with a very large organisation, and you think the values come from the management, but it appears that your values comes from your senior manager or your line manager. So I think it's really important that it feeds all the way through. And unfortunately, occasionally from my line manager, I get emails at 9 or 10 o'clock at night. But I think we also need to educate the line managers, and we need to, it's all well good putting these out of office responses on, and they do work to an extent. But as soon as you stop doing that, it's easy to slip back into bad habits. I think we need to keep reinforcing the fact that we need to follow this policy.
Yeah, definitely. And with that in mind then, Lorna, what would you say to someone who is feeling as if, there's an issue that they want to raise around their working hours? What would be the best practice that you would suggest for anyone who might be feeling that way?
Yeah, definitely. I think if anybody's feeling that way, generally the first port of call you would like to say is the line manager. Now, I know sometimes that direction could come from the manager themselves, but generally employees should feel comfortable and should be encouraged to speak to their line manager. At the end of the day, it is a manager's responsibility to ensure their workers feel good and are sort of being looked after. And so that includes listening to those concerns. But again, if that's maybe not working out, and again, depending on the organisation size, you may want to talk to the EAP, so the Employee Assistance Programme, or you might want to reach out to your occupational health advisor. And so there's a bunch of sort of ways that people can raise those concerns. But I do think it's important that line managers are made aware, because they are responsible to sort of look after that person, but also to remove those barriers and challenges. But the other, I suppose, flip side of that, Davina, is, and I'm guilty of this myself, is sometimes I take on too much or take a little bit more than I should. I think that's just the nature of how people work these days. Mm-hmm. So I guess there's a bit and I'm not discounting the employee should raise it, but asking yourself, is there something I can say no to or push back on, or maybe just log off at 5 o'clock and that's okay? A bit to Mark's point about that, that's okay, and I need to do that. So maybe there's a piece around empowering yourself as well as making sure that your manager is aware of that as well, I think would be important.
Definitely, that empowerment piece and the communication piece that I'm hearing is so important, especially in this remote working environment. And we do have some officers who will be planning for their return around August, September time. So again, there's another change going to happen, a lot more communication and a lot of stress that may come with that change as well. And so in that sense, I know you've both got experience of working in the industry and seeing how organizations are evolving and responding to the pandemic. Are you anticipating any key changes or changes in performance management that may be helpful in helping people maintain that sense of autonomy and flexibility in their work? Lorna, I'll go to you first, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I've been thinking about this, Davina. I think we were always sort of getting into that direction of flexible working, blended working approaches. Some companies a little bit more advanced, some a little bit less, but that's okay. I think the pandemic has expedited that, not just for employers, but also employees, maybe who've worked in companies who before were told, but you can't work from home, you can't do this or that, and now we're seeing that's possible. So I think the expectation is now set. I think each company will need to respond to that based on their business model and what they need to deliver and what types of business roles that they have in their business, but equally listening to their employees in terms of their expectation, because there will be, I suppose, some people who want to come back to the office, and we've seen that in Diageo. There are people who are absolutely delighted to get back to St. James's Gate, why wouldn't they? Some people who want a blended approach, and some who'd like to continue to work from home. I think it's up to us as an employer to find a way to make that work, but also to the employee to figure out what works best for them. So I think there'll be blended approaches. We have introduced a flexible working arrangement policy. A lot of companies are bringing that into play as well. So some of these pieces are coming. I think you mentioned as well about the performance management piece. This is an interesting one, especially from an HR perspective. Some companies I know through the pandemic have just removed the requirement for performance reviews, just to take that to ease the tension and take the pressure off employees, which I know for companies has been welcome. I think the curiosity now for companies is, how do we performance manage somebody I don't see every day? So I'm a manager who's used to seeing somebody at a desk every day. That's no longer there, possibly. So I think there's a responsibility to help managers to be able to support people, because we will need to have some form of performance management. How that looks, I think that could evolve too. But I think back to showing that level of autonomy, that level of trust, and also empowering managers to empower their teams and say, that's okay. We've all delivered in a pandemic and virtually. But I do think there's probably some level of concern and curiosity around managers, how they will do that. I think HR has a role to play, the organisation and the leaders have a role to play to say, we can do this and we should do this. And the other piece I will say very quickly is, there's a piece around attracting talent. And I think more and more employees are expecting this level of blended approach, flexible working. So as an employer, we need to be ahead of that as well, not behind. So I think there's a bunch of things that are coming, quite exciting, quite a pace for HR, but I think lots of opportunity for our people as well.
Definitely. And over to you, Mark, on the same thing, because I know in the past we've spoken around expectations of employees and generational differences that are coming through into the workplace and how that's influencing future workforce planning.
Yeah, I think I've read quite a few reports now, and people think we're all going to work from home, and I really can't see that. I think gradually people will go back to the office. And I think it's too soon to say working, or as an academic, I've worked at home quite a lot, so I guess I'm used to working at home. But for a lot of people, they're not used to working from home, and a lot of people don't want to work from home. Maybe in the first month or second month of lockdown, it seemed quite nice. But I think there's lots of issues we need to cover. A lot of people don't have I'm lucky, I've got an office at home. I've got, I can tell my children to be quiet. I can sit in an unreasonable. But I know some people, you meet people on Zoom and they're working on the bed, they're working on the kitchen table, and we notice a lot more people now getting musculoskeletal disorders because they're sitting in the wrong position. They're sitting too long in the same position because they fear that if they're not there when the Zoom goes or the call goes, the boss will think they're being lazy or watching TV. I also think there's sort of personality issues. Some people want to be in the office or want to be with other people, and some people prefer being on their own. But also people who we've done some work looking at social isolation, and the people, and unfortunately with people who report social isolation, they're the ones unlikely to actually call out and say, I'm feeling lonely. They sit there in silence. I think that's could cause a lot of issues sort of later on. And I often wonder, when people go back, if you're actually in the office, is it good to be seen? And are you more likely to get promoted or get the better sort of work because you're in the office? I don't know. In the long term, are we going to see differences in the way people are judged by being at work or at home? I think there's lots of things that we need to consider. And I know from this is just very small samples and people I've been talking to, but certainly the young people want to be in work. They don't want to be at home. They want to meet people. They want to discuss people. Perhaps the older people are more, I'm talking about myself here, are more happy to be at home and quite content. And I guess it all depends, there's so many different variables. I think the basic message is there's not going to be one model that fits all. I think we've got to look at all things in isolation, really. I think there's so many variables. We need to be careful. We don't just, brush the whole thing over and say this is, it's good to work from home. It's certainly good for some people, but not all people. And so lots of things we need to consider first. And the work I do is about switching off from work. And we know that people from home, a lot of people find it really, really difficult to switch off because your home is, your bedroom may be 2 feet from the office or whatever, So it's really difficult. There's lots of things we need to consider, really.
And on that then, Mark, what would you say, what strategies would you give to someone who is struggling to switch off from work, who is, working at home and has limited space or? Yeah,
what we before lockdown we used to say when you got home always sort of hide anything to do with work. And I did meet one person once actually who, this sounds really, and I thought he was mad at the time, but I think he was quite right. He told me he used to work from home and he used to put a suit on in the morning. So in the morning he used to get out of bed, have a shower, put his suit on, go into his office at home, work, and in his break times he'll have his breaks as normal. So that at the end of the day he'll take his suit off, put it on the door in the office, go out and put his whatever with a tracksuit bottom or whatever, and for him that signaled the day was finished. And I think we probably need to develop sort of routines. So we talk about these things called unwinding rituals. So when you're at work, you do certain things towards the end of the day that teaches the mind or trains the mind that it's time to go home now, it's time to switch off from work. So organising your desk, cleaning your mug, switching the heater off, whatever. But you do this on a regular basis, I think it teaches the body this is definitely time to switch off. I think one good thing would be, if it's possible, is to actually go for a walk. As soon as you finish your work, if you happen to live in a nice area where you can go for a 10 or 15-minute walk, just to get out of that house, I think that's the key, really. Or do a bit of exercise. Do something completely different to what your work is. I think the worst thing is come out of the office or come switch on the TV and sit and watch TV, because you're probably watching TV and you probably think, I'll just check the emails on the phone, everybody's phone. So you need to completely get away from the environment. I think that's the key. Distraction is the key, really, distracting yourself.
And it becomes addictive then as well if you're queuing, if you're priming yourself, to sit down, watch TV, you've got your phone at hand, maybe I'll just see what's coming through, checking your emails periodically, and in the background you're still thinking about work, as you're saying, you're still thinking about your to-do list or what's coming up the next day. Or if you get a particularly stressful email come in, and maybe that's your evening left kind of ruined, and you're worrying about the next day and what you have to do. So it is that conscious kind of distraction techniques and making that virtual commute kind of come alive. I understand what you're saying with the suit, but I can definitely see how it helps 16 months in now.
Dina, also it's planning the evening as well. So I think sometimes, if I don't want people to get obsessed by the evening and plan every hour, but I think you need to say, Tuesday night I'm going to do this, Wednesday night I'll do this. So if you don't have any sort of plans, you will then end, because you're working all day, your mind naturally goes back to work. So you start working. So it's good to say, go for a walk one day or do something, but have something like a hobby or something to do in the evening.
Yeah, definitely. And we've got a question coming here, and it says, how can someone disconnect if their work is not picked up by anyone else? Hence, if they don't do extra hours, they will be behind with deadlines, etc. Lorna, maybe from a HR perspective, I might pass that one across to you.
Yeah, I think it's kind of similar to the last answer in terms of speaking to your manager. And I'm not naive enough to say that never happens and people don't get given extra work. But the one thing I've learned over the years is if that continues, ultimately something will give. And more often than not, it's somebody's well-being, or you might lose somebody great out of your team. So hopeful that you have a good manager or employer. I think it's really important to speak up because, to Mark's point earlier, people need to, switch off in order to be better at work as much as be better for themselves. So most employers will pay attention to that. And I know there are some times when, you have a busy period or it's a busy season at work and it requires that. That should not become the norm. And I think when that happens, people are at risk of burnout. So I think there's a piece around speaking up, expecting to see some level of shift. It could be a prioritization conversation, or somebody needs to help me, but it's also okay to speak up. I think often people feel, well, if I speak up, will this go against me from a career perspective, or will it seem I'm not up for this? And I think it's actually the opposite. I think people need to say it, because my saddest moment is when I see a great talent either leave us or not have interest in the role anymore, or not feel part of something because we didn't or they didn't have that conversation. So that's sort of my main sort of suggestion and recommendation is have that conversation. Because if you don't, something will give, and most likely it will be you, and that's not okay.
And in that sense, then I'm hearing a lot around the need to train our managers and our leadership teams in how to support their team members in this evolving environment.
Yeah, and I think actually a lot can come from managers and leaders around this, how they set the standard too in terms of working. And I can say I have a wonderful manager who, switches off and doesn't expect any of us to connect after working hours. And that makes me feel, okay, well, I can do that as well. So I think there's a lot to be said around leaders leading through this and empowering themselves. Like I say, you can have busy periods. We've all gone through a year of a very busy year, if I can call it that, with so many reactions as opposed to responses to situations. But it's important that that's not a norm. And I think leaders need to really pay attention to themselves and how they lead in this space, but also to their teams. And that is a responsibility on leaders and HR as well.
And that comes back to what you were saying, Mark, around, the values of the organisation are what you see your manager doing. The role modelling of their behaviour is what feeds into your direct reports' behaviour. Yes,
and I'll just follow up with something Lorna picked up on actually about the working conditions. And also finding now, this is something we've picked up, and I've got no real hard data on this, and just talking to various people, it seems like the younger generation will not put up with these issues, where people like me, we tend to be in the same job long term. But a lot of young people now, if the job doesn't seem to match up with their values, they'll just go to another job, and they feel not obliged or to stay with their present employer. So I think it's really emphasis on the managers and employers to actually help the workers to stay to manage sort of flexible working and helping people to switch off and all these issues, because the bottom line is it will help their organisation.
Yeah, and that kind of just links into another question that's come through here as well, and it's saying, well, what advice would you give where your management expects you to do overtime or be flexible with your colleagues and not to follow the right to disconnect because there is a belief that doing overtime and adding more projects is the only way to get promoted? So I think there's an internal pressure as well there that, I can only progress in this company, if I am shown to be over available. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can add a comment if Mark, if you'd like, and then if you want to. Yeah. We're doing a nice double act here, Mark. So I think there's a couple of things I would say to that. When you're looking at people for career and promotion, you're looking at what they deliver, but also their potential. And there's one thing about delivering and over-delivering, but I think it's about what you can bring to that next role or that next opportunity. And it's not necessarily always about output and delivery. So I think most organizations will pay attention to that as well. I think it depends on the organization and the culture, and that's a whole other conversation around what's expected. But I think it's remiss of a manager not to listen, but also an employee not to have that conversation. Now, again, sometimes perception can come into this as well. If I speak up or I say I can't do this, I don't have capacity, this will be deemed I'm lazy, I don't have the ability, I don't have that drive. And 9 times out of 10, that's not at all how it will come across to a manager in conversation. Most managers are managers because they've worked and they've navigated how to overcome some of these challenges themselves. Now, I know there are other times where some managers might just have gotten it to their positions through that and expected I think that's a challenge that isn't insurmountable, but something to be aware of. So I do think it's, again, having that conversation around, this is what I'd like to achieve. How would that look like and what should I do? And if that feels like that's too much or it's taking on too much, it's okay to say, look, I want to deliver something that's value add and makes a difference to the team and the business, and this is how I'll do it. And honestly, I have seen people some top performers who work whatever their working hours, and that's it. Because exactly to Mark's point, they switch off and they come back and they're ready to go, their minds are sharp, and they're ahead of the game in terms of some of the work that they do. So I think there's conversations with your manager. The cultural element needs consideration, but also just being bold to take that time and actually having really value-add performance when you are on. But again, I know it can be quite specific to managers and cultures in organisations as well.
And Mark, were you going to add anything to that?
No, I was saying it's interesting in the times now, because there's a lot of emphasis now on sort of the individual's employee being resilient, where it's a match or mismatch between the job and the person. So some people may need a bit more space or less space or work. It's not necessarily people working in less not so hard as somebody else, but people may work in different ways. And I think a good manager, if people start leaving or being stressed, it reflect back on the manager. And I think this will be flagged even higher if it turnover. So and the other issue, if somebody sort of come on the comments says you're expected to do this lot of work and produce work outside working hours, I think in them situations, if you can survive the sort of the short-term rush and doing this work, you've obviously showed you can work, and then you're in a good position to move on, because you don't want to stay in a company that's going to do that expectation. If they don't learn, unfortunately some people do not learn. One of my colleagues, I'm not saying where from, he's just changed jobs because his manager just expected too much, just pushed and pushed and pushed. And it's a top ranking university actually, and he said, this university didn't get where it was by switching off at 5 o'clock, and it's just completely alien. But he lost a very, very good employee that way. So it does reflect back on the management.
And I think what the pandemic has done as well is bring people more into alignment with their values, and wanting to have a happy, healthy, safe life. So it makes the tolerance levels for the additional stress on an already stressful environment much less appeasable to just kind of carry on pushing through and carrying on. We've got another question that's come through here, and it's just asking then, well, how do you start that conversation with the manager if you're saying, you want to talk about your stress levels? We've already touched on a few things, in the sense of having the conversation, and, as difficult as it may be, there's a starting point. But it might also be a little bit difficult in the remote world where you're not seeing everyone every day. Usually, you know your colleagues' baseline. You can tell when they're overwhelmed or when their behaviors are changing, and that can incite the conversation as well. So I guess there's a change happening where it's not maybe as collaborative as it once was. It might be a little bit more ownership for the employee to step up and to have that conversation. Lorna, have you seen any experiences from colleagues, past or present, who may have been struggling with stress in the workplace and how they approached it?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll probably touch on the pandemic because, it's the theme of the day. But one of the things that's quite interesting is before the pandemic, most people were in offices at least a couple of days a week. And sometimes it's very physical, or it's very obvious to people around that somebody maybe not okay. And I think that's sort of gone away with this piece where you might just see somebody for half an hour for a week and that's it. So I think that has added to this, I suppose, challenge sometimes for people to raise how they're feeling. I suppose a couple of things. If a manager in a one-to-one doesn't just ask how you are, and sometimes that doesn't happen because we're busy, if they don't open that up, I think it's okay to invite that conversation to open yourself, to say, look, I would like to spend 10 minutes either at the start of our one-to-one or the end of our one-to-one, or maybe even more time, whatever that might be. There's just something I'd like to bring up with you and get your thoughts on and advice. So it's very much a collaborative sort of approach and conversation. And also share how you're feeling. I think sometimes people go, I can't say this to my manager, but that's what they're there for, and that's the role of a manager, to listen and to support, and they'll have that from theirs and so on. That's really what should be there. So it's knowing that it's okay to say, I'd like to spend 10 or 15 minutes in this one-to-one, or I'd like to have a call with you just to have a catch up. I'd like to just share how I'm feeling. And And it can be just as simple as that. Now, what it might lead on to is I'd like to be able to maybe take something off my to-do list this week, or can you help me prioritize? Or do you know what, I'd like to just take a couple of hours back for a long week I had last week, and opening that up with your manager. And again, I will say 9 times out of 10, most managers will be open and willing to have that conversation. A couple of other things, and I know I mentioned it earlier, if you're not comfortable maybe to have that conversation with your manager, you can obviously chat to your HR partner, whoever that might be, talk to a colleague, your employee assistance program. So there's a whole bunch of routes you can go into in terms of preparing for that conversation. But ultimately, having that conversation with your managers is going to really help overcome some of those challenges. And I suppose, as I say, removing those concerns that there'll be a reaction as opposed to a response, because most often there'll be a response. I hope.
And it is a daunting experience to go through if you are unsure what response you might get. So I've heard from other people as well where they might prepare their speaking points just to keep them focused, because naturally when you are stressed, your mind it's harder to focus on what you want to speak about, because the emotions are increasing. So that can also help. Mark, is there anything else that you would add to that one? Just if there are any hesitations on preparing for a discussion that might be potentially stressful?
No, because I normally see people want to be sort of sent to me via the managers, but I think my advice would be sort of following on is to set it in an email, because then you've got something to show, say this, raise this concern, and if it's not being addressed, I think you've got justification then to go further and take it to HR or somebody else. But I think people would more likely respond in an email and do it sort of in a formal way than just saying to your manager, I'm not feeling great, I'm feeling a bit busy at the moment. If it's getting too stressful, I know for the, if it's minor stress, obviously just a conversation will work. But if you're feeling really, depressed or upset or stressed, sort of, or suffering burnout, then I think you should send an email and alert the manager.
Yeah, and we've got another question here from Rachel then, and it's just saying, any advice when leaders within an organisation regularly email out of hours? Lorna, I know you mentioned, the footers that some managers have on their emails, I might be emailing you late, but I don't expect to reply.
Yeah, I would encourage all organisations, everybody to have that on their footer, because even a small thing like that can be impactful. I think when leaders email, because sometimes that can set a tone, okay, I should be on, it's 9 o'clock and I got an email from X, I need to reply, but it's okay not to. And I think the more that you engage with that, the more the expectation will be set that you do. That's their choice. Maybe they have other reasons why they're working at that time. And I know sometimes there might be an expectation, but I think my view is it's okay not to reply. It's okay not to engage. If it's not your working time, it's not your working time. And I think, again, it's back to this piece where I think a lot of people, there's a perception, well, if I don't, I'm this or I'm that. Not at all. In fact, there might be more, to Mark's point, the leaders set the standard, and maybe there should be an expectation that the leader doesn't do that or has that on their email, more so than the employee having to sort of engage at different hours.
And I guess with parents as well, we have seen, people splitting up their working day to share the care of their children, and that might impact how people work and when they're online and not online as well. How do you, with in relation to parents, is there anything that we could be thinking about in relation to the right to disconnect? Specifically to parents, is it?
So again, I think with parents, it's sort of setting out what you'd like your working hours to be, because there's a bunch of sort of general guidance, there's policies, there's legislation from, carers leave to parental leave, there's a bunch of different leave types that are available to employees in Ireland. So most organisations will have policies around that. So that might mean you have reduced working hours or different working patterns. Again, it's setting that out. It's saying, okay, I work these hours, and being okay to say no outside of those hours. Again, employers should empower employees to do that, and employees should know if an organisation has signed off on you taking this time or working this pattern, then you work this pattern. Sometimes you do see creep either from the side of the business or the employee, where you see them working on hours or days that they shouldn't normally be working. I think that requires a conversation between the manager and the employee. And again, I suppose Mark raised a good point. Pop that in writing, and if it doesn't resolve itself, speak to their manager or come to your HR support as well. But know that it's okay to work the hours that you've signed up for. One of the things I've learned over the years is parents feel compelled, if they work part-time, oh, well, I better answer that email or I'll just catch up on that project. And they end up working full-time hours, being paid for part-time. And this level of sort of disengagement will kick in as well. So I think it's really important, if you've signed up and the company supported that, both sides are supportive. And if not, that needs addressing.
And the right to disconnect, it does, the code of conduct does talk about emergency situations, where there's business requirement, then we can give allowances for that. Do you want to just mention a few points on that, Lorna?
Yeah, absolutely. So look at, it's give and take like anything in relation to the code. There might be a time where an employee, let's say, works Monday to Wednesday and there's a project meeting for a month that needs to happen on a Thursday. It might be that they need to engage with that, but that's a short-term piece, or they get the time back. It should be the exception as opposed to the rule. And if that starts to flip, then back to the code piece as well, something's not right and needs addressing. But like that, I suppose from an employer's perspective, there would be an expectation of meet in the middle. There might be one-off situations where the employer might need the employee, and the employee being okay with that is important as well. But I always come back to, it should be an exception and not a rule, because if you see creep on that, then it needs addressing again straight away.
Thanks, Lorna. So I think we're coming to the end of the session now, and I just want to ask if there are any final thoughts from both of yourselves, just in relation to maybe Mark, this need to switch off the recovery process and
we cover that. I can't emphasise the importance of switching off, because it's been associated with cardiovascular disease, psychological disease, even deviance at work. Not being recovering from work has been associated with deviance at work. But going back to the point about emails, I think it is in terms of, would you expect your boss to knock on your door and hand you a bit of paper and say, I want this report read? But they're intruding into our private lives by, we're paying for the internet ourselves. It's our internet. And I know people to put messages on, say, don't respond to the email. Sorry, I was in the gym last night, or I went to see my grandmother. You can even put it on your out of office responses. So if somebody emails you at 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock at night, have an out of office, sorry, I'm out this evening. And you unfortunately have to train people that you're not going to respond. I think as soon as people realise you're not the person to respond in the evening, they'll go on to somebody else normally, and they'll push it on. So I think we've got to be sort of proactive. I don't mean a bit deviant to this, but we've got to do techniques to show that we're not working in the evening. Working, and this is my time. I'm doing a course in the evening. I'm at the gym. I'm doing other things. I'm spending time with the family, and just don't respond to the emails.
I think that's probably been harder as well during the pandemic, where we haven't had places to go and things to fill our time, and naturally work has been a filler for some people. I know great people who have really strong boundaries, and when their day is finished, they're finished and they're on to the next thing. So I think it's been a really encouraging point in time to engage in that personal development, to develop those hobbies again, as we're seeing all through social media, how people are picking up new hobbies and skills with the additional time that they have.
Unfortunately, with the COVID, I think people have been so anxious about their jobs. They've seen their colleagues being made redundant, so they feel they've had to be shown to be working. That's one of the unfortunate things, and that's really difficult to stop.
Yeah, I think that level of anxiety has been very clear for many people throughout this pandemic. And Lorna, over to yourself. Just any closing notes on that front then? Yeah,
I plus one to what Mark has said. I think as well, this is a time of opportunity for both employers and employees, actually. I think Mark is right, there's a lot of uncertainty, so people feel compelled to work certain hours or work in a certain way. But actually more and more people are expecting flexibility and well-being to be part of their working environment. And I think it's not just the right thing to do for people and employees, but it's also a business imperative. The war on talent, the expectation, that discretionary effort in the right way, not outside of working hours, is hugely important. And actually, I think organizations who pay attention and invest in this will come out on top in terms of having the best people and the most engaged teams. So I think the only way is up in relation to some of the topics that we've touched on today. So yeah, it's an exciting time.
A hopeful one. Yeah, there's lots of change coming, lots of challenges with that, but hopefully, as you're saying, lots of opportunity as well. Lorna, Mark, thank you so much for your time and being here today. It's been wonderful having you to share your insights and thoughts and knowledge on this topic. We are now going to head across to the final closing notes from Richard Murphy, CEO of CFO Health. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.